17 fake HOA violations couldn't move me, so Karen brought bolt cutters instead. She never expected what those cameras had already captured. I came home expecting another quiet morning in the Montana mountains. Instead, my cabin door stood open, my steel padlock lay cut in the gravel, and someone had searched every map and deed inside my home without taking a single valuable. The security cameras showed exactly who walked through that door, but they couldn't explain why. It wasn't until helicopters appeared over my meadow that the truth finally came into view. Stay with me, because every document, every lie, and every choice led to one moment nobody saw coming. And before we get started, if you enjoy stories where ordinary people stand their ground with patience, evidence, and the law, not anger, I think you'll feel right at home here. Subscribe to the channel, and let's get into today's story. The first thing I noticed wasn't the broken lock. It was the silence. Most mornings, my cabin greeted me with familiar sounds. The faint creak of lodgepole pines rubbing together. The trickle of water feeding the stock pond beyond the meadow. The soft clunk of the wind chime hanging from the porch beam. That morning, all of it felt wrong. The silence had weight, like someone had disturbed the place and the mountain itself hadn't decided whether to breathe again. I eased my old Ford F-250 to a stop beside the timber gate and shut off the engine. The steel padlock I'd installed only 3 weeks earlier lay in the gravel, cut clean through, no scratches, no failed attempt, one sharp bite from a pair of bolt cutters. For a long moment, I simply stared at it. 31 years repairing heavy equipment for the Forest Service teaches you to recognize tool marks. Machines leave signatures. So do people. Whoever did this hadn't been angry. They'd been prepared. I stepped out, picked up the severed lock, and rolled it over in my hand. Fresh steel still shined where the jaws had sliced through it. They hadn't even bothered taking the pieces. They wanted me to see exactly what they'd done. The front door stood slightly open. I hadn't left it that way. My heartbeat slowed instead of speeding up. That's something retirement never took away. When you've spent decades troubleshooting hydraulic failures miles from the nearest road, panic only makes expensive problems worse. I walked inside. Nothing looked destroyed. Nothing valuable appeared missing. My rifle still rested in its locked cabinet. The old cast-iron stove sat exactly where I'd left it. My grandfather's pocket watch remained on the mantel. Yet someone had touched almost everything that mattered. Every filing drawer stood half open. Survey maps covered my kitchen table. Plastic sleeves protecting property records had been pulled out and stacked beside my chair. The folder containing my county deeds had been opened. Another held handwritten notes I'd made over the years about property lines and old fence corners. They hadn't stolen my life. They'd searched it. I stood perfectly still. There was only one set of muddy boot prints crossing the pine floor toward my office cabinet. Another pair, smaller, led beside them. They stopped in front of the locked metal file chest tucked beneath my workbench. The chest remained unopened. Whoever came here hadn't found what they wanted. I crouched beside those boot prints. The mud still held bits of crushed cedar bark from the logging road leading through Cedar Ridge Preserve. That narrowed the list considerably. I walked back outside without touching anything else. My wildlife cameras uploaded motion alerts through a satellite connection whenever I was away. I'd installed them years ago because black bears enjoyed investigating my woodshed almost as much as I enjoyed keeping them out of it. Today they weren't recording bears. I opened the camera app, 4 alerts, yesterday, 2:14 p.m. The first clip showed a white SUV stopping beside my gate. The driver's door opened. Elaine Whitford climbed out wearing pressed khaki pants, a navy vest, and sunglasses that probably cost more than my chainsaw. Even from 30 yards away, I recognized the deliberate way she carried herself, chin high, shoulders back, as though every patch of ground automatically belonged to her. The passenger door opened. Her son, Noah, stepped out carrying a long pair of red-handled bolt cutters. Neither of them hesitated. No knocking, no phone call, no warrant, no permission. Noah positioned the cutters. One squeeze, the lock snapped. Elaine smiled. Not a big just the kind people wear when they're certain they'll never be questioned. The second camera picked them up walking toward the porch. The third showed them disappearing inside my cabin. The fourth watched them leave 43 minutes later. Elaine carried several folded maps. Noah looked irritated. He shook his head as they reached the SUV. They argued briefly. Then they drove away. I replayed the footage 3 times. Not because I doubted what I'd seen, because something about it didn't fit. Elaine had spent nearly 8 months trying to convince every county office within driving distance that my cabin somehow violated rules that had never applied to my land. 17 violation notices. 3 agency complaints. Everyone dismissed. If all she'd wanted was to intimidate me, she'd already failed. So why risk breaking into private property? Why search filing cabinets instead of stealing valuables? Why spend 43 minutes inside a cabin only to leave empty-handed? I looked across my 18 acres toward the tree line where Cedar Ridge Preserve began. Morning sunlight was finally pushing over the ridges. Everything out there looked peaceful. But peaceful and safe aren't the same thing. I slipped the broken padlock into my jacket pocket. Then I asked myself the only question that mattered. What were Elaine Whitford and her son so desperate to find that they were willing to commit a crime to get it? I had a feeling the answer wasn't inside my cabin anymore. It was buried somewhere in the history of the land itself. The broken padlock stayed in my truck's center console all week. Every time I reached for my keys, I saw those clean-cut steel edges and reminded myself of one thing. People don't risk criminal trespass unless they believe what they're after is worth more than the consequences. 8 months earlier, none of this existed. My 18 acres sat quietly against the eastern edge of Cedar Ridge Preserve, separated from the subdivision by an old logging road and a line of ponderosa pines that had stood longer than any homeowners association. I bought the property years before Cedar Ridge even filed its incorporation papers. My deed had been recorded. My taxes went to Lincoln County. I had never attended a board meeting, signed a covenant, or accepted a single HOA restriction. Elaine Whitford simply refused to believe that mattered. The first letter arrived by certified mail. Community standards violation. According to Elaine, smoke from my wood stove negatively affected neighborhood aesthetics. I laughed the first time I read it. Then I noticed the official-looking letterhead, the legal citations, the bold deadlines. It wasn't written to convince me. It was written to intimidate me. I called the number listed beneath her signature. She answered on the second ring. "Mr. Mercer," she said pleasantly, "I'm glad you've decided to cooperate. I think you mailed this to the wrong address." "No. I'm not part of Cedar Ridge. Your property directly impacts the community. My property borders the community. That's a distinction without much difference." "It is to the county recorder." Her voice cooled. "We're simply asking for reasonable compliance. You don't have authority over my land." There was a brief pause. Then she delivered the sentence that stayed with me for months. "Authority evolves, Mr. Mercer. Communities grow." I ended the call without another word. Over the next 6 weeks, the letters multiplied. One claimed my firewood stacks attracted pests. Another insisted my workshop generated excessive industrial noise. Then came a complaint alleging my cabin violated architectural harmony because the exterior stain was inconsistent with surrounding neighborhood design. The nearest HOA home sat nearly a quarter-mile away. Every notice ended exactly the same way. Failure to comply may result in additional enforcement. Additional enforcement arrived faster than I expected. A county fire inspector visited first. He checked my chimney, measured clearances, reviewed permits. Everything passed. 3 days later, wildlife officials appeared after receiving an anonymous report that I was feeding bears. They found bird feeders. Nothing else. The following week, a county code officer inspected my workshop after someone reported I was operating a commercial repair business. He looked around for 15 minutes before smiling. "You retired?" "2 years ago." "Thought so." He closed his clipboard. "Looks like somebody's confusing hobbies with zoning violations." Case closed. 3 agencies, 3 investigations, 3 dismissals. Each one should have ended the matter. Instead, every dismissal made Elaine more aggressive. That was when the 4th envelope arrived. Unlike the others, it wasn't from the HOA. The return address belonged to something called Northwest Environmental Resource Consulting. The report claimed runoff from my small stock pond threatened drainage flowing toward Cedar Ridge Preserve. It recommended immediate environmental mitigation. The language sounded technical, almost convincing. Almost. The consultant's signature caught my attention. Noah Whitford, same last name. I opened my laptop. Montana's business registry took less than 5 minutes to search. Northwest Environmental Resource Consulting had been registered only 4 months earlier. Its mailing address matched a lakeside property inside Cedar Ridge Preserve. Owner of record, Elaine Whitford. Registered agent, Noah Whitford. I leaned back in my chair. The room suddenly felt much quieter. Elaine hadn't hired independent experts. She'd built her own, not to solve environmental problems, to manufacture them. I printed the registration records, added them to a growing folder labeled simply Whitford. The folder already contained 17 HOA notices, 3 agency closure letters, inspection reports, certified mail receipts. Now it held proof that the so-called environmental review originated inside Elaine's own household. This had stopped being neighborhood politics. It had become something organized. I looked once more at the surveillance footage of Elaine searching my filing cabinet. She wasn't trying to enforce community standards. She was hunting for something. The fake reports, the inspections, the break-in, they all pointed toward the same unanswered question. If none of this had ever been about smoke, wildlife, or my cabin, what exactly was Elaine Whitford trying so desperately to claim? That question changed how I approached everything after that. Until then, I'd been defending myself. From that day forward, I started building a case. I drove into Libby the following Monday, carrying a cardboard box that already held every violation notice, every inspection report, every certified mail receipt, and copies of the business records connecting Elaine to Noah's consulting company. Attorney Grace Holloway spread everything across a conference table without saying a word. She read for nearly 20 minutes. Finally, she looked up. "You've done something most people don't." I answered every accusation. "You documented every accusation." She tapped one county inspection report. "They keep making allegations." She tapped another. "The government keeps disproving them." Then she smiled. Every false complaint becomes evidence that someone is abusing the process. For the first time since finding the broken lock, I felt the balance shift. Just a little. Grace wasn't interested in emotional arguments. She wanted timelines, dates, receipts, photographs. She had me organize everything into a chronological binder. Every complaint received its own section. Every inspection result followed immediately behind it. When we finished, the pattern practically explained itself. Complaint, investigation, dismissal, complaint, investigation, dismissal, 17 times. Grace closed the binder. "Don't send them anything yet." "Why?" "Because people like Elaine make mistakes when they think they're still winning." That advice stayed with me. Instead of responding, I kept collecting. I ordered certified copies of my recorded deed, certified parcel maps, tax payment history, boundary surveys, even copies of the subdivision plat that created Cedar Ridge Preserve years after I'd purchased my property. Every document carried an official county seal. Every seal mattered. 2 days later, Grace introduced me to someone she'd trusted for years. Owen Pierce, 74 years old, retired county surveyor, the kind of man who still carried pencils sharpened with a pocket knife. His garage looked less like a workshop than a paper archive. Metal cabinets stretched from floor to ceiling. Rolled plats filled wooden bins. Boxes labeled by decade lined the walls. He listened quietly while I explained the situation. When I finished, he reached toward an old county map hanging beside his desk. Most people only search digital records. He pointed toward the mountains. But this county existed a long time before scanners. He disappeared into a back room. Several minutes later, he returned, carrying a weathered tube tied with faded cloth tape. Original subdivision plats. He laid the brittle sheets across his drafting table. The paper smelled faintly of dust and old ink. Survey lines crossed the page in careful black strokes. Parcel numbers, benchmarks, corner monuments, everything drawn by hand. Owen adjusted his glasses. They changed this map later. What changed? I don't know yet. He leaned closer. The copies everyone uses aren't always the originals. For 3 hours, we compared archived plats against current county records. Most differences were harmless. Road names updated, parcel numbers modernized, minor corrections. Then Owen stopped moving. His finger rested on a small notation near the northeast corner of my property. He frowned. That's interesting. What is? I've never noticed that notation before. The writing had nearly disappeared beneath decades of copying. Only fragments remained visible. Emergency. Landing. Access. The final word had faded almost completely. Owen looked at me. I'll need the original county archive. Can we get it? He nodded. It won't be digitized. How long? If it's still stored where I think it is. He smiled slightly. Tomorrow. Driving home that evening, I couldn't stop thinking about the maps Elaine had unfolded inside my cabin. Not jewelry, not firearms, not cash. Maps. She hadn't searched my life. She'd searched my land. The next morning, my phone rang before 8. It was Owen. His normally steady voice carried something I hadn't heard before. Excitement. Cole, you found it? I found something. What? A long pause. You'd better come to the recorder's office. Is it bad? No. Another pause. I think it's the reason someone broke into your cabin. I was in my truck less than 5 minutes later. By the time I reached the Lincoln County Recorder's office, Owen Pierce already had 3 oversized plat maps spread across a wooden archive table. Beside them sat a thick ledger bound in cracked brown leather, the kind of county record that existed long before anyone thought about scanning documents into computers. Grace Holloway was already there. She looked at me, then at the maps. You'll want to see this yourself. Owen adjusted a magnifying lamp over the oldest survey. This is the original field plat from 1974. He pointed toward the northeast corner of my property. The faded notation he'd mentioned the day before was now perfectly visible under the stronger light. State Emergency Helicopter Landing Easement. Width, 120 feet. Purpose, wildfire suppression and emergency medical evacuation only. Perpetual, non-transferable. I read it twice, then a third time. I've owned this place for 11 years. Owen nodded. I'm not surprised. It was never mentioned. Because it doesn't affect ownership. Grace slid another document beside it. The easement belongs to the state of Montana. Not Lincoln County? No. The HOA? She almost laughed. Absolutely not. Owen reached into another folder. This is where things become interesting. He unfolded a more recent survey filed only 18 months earlier. At first glance, it looked identical. Same parcels, same roads, same property lines. But a shaded corridor had been added along the edge of my meadow. The label read, Proposed Shared Community Emergency Access Corridor. I frowned. I've never seen this. You weren't supposed to. Grace tapped the filing stamp. It was submitted as supporting documentation. Supporting what? She handed me another document. Application for preliminary recreational access review. Applicant, Northwest Environmental Resource Consulting. Authorized representative, Noah Whitford. I felt my jaw tighten. So Noah wasn't writing fake environmental reports. No. Grace folded her arms. He was building a paper trail. Owen nodded. If nobody challenged these filings, later applications could reference them as existing documentation. In other words, they were trying to normalize something that never legally existed. The room suddenly felt much smaller. The fake inspections, the environmental reports, the endless complaints. They had never been the objective. They were distractions. Grace spread another sheet across the table. A glossy development concept map, colored renderings, walking trails, scenic overlooks, kayak launch, future recreation expansion. One bright red line crossed directly through the northeast corner of my property, straight across the helicopter easement. I looked at Grace. They're expanding Cedar Ridge. They're trying to, and my land is in the way. One corner of it. Just one corner? She nodded. But it's the only practical route connecting the existing subdivision to nearly 400 acres of timberland recently purchased by a private development group. Everything clicked into place. Elaine hadn't cared about my wood stove, or my pond, or my firewood. She cared that I refused to cooperate. She had expected enough pressure would convince me to sign something. Anything. An advisory agreement, an access acknowledgement, a community partnership. Once my signature existed, lawyers could argue I'd recognized some level of HOA authority. Grace looked directly at me. Now think about your cabin. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I pictured my office exactly as I'd found it. The filing cabinet, the unfolded surveys, the metal document chest. They weren't searching for valuables. No. They were looking for this. I held up the original plat. The original survey. Owen nodded. If they believed you had archived copies at home, they hoped to remove them, or confirm whether you knew they existed. Silence settled across the room. Not fear, understanding. Finally, Grace broke it. I'm filing preservation notices today. What does that do? It formally notifies every agency involved that the original records are now disputed evidence. So nobody can quietly replace them? Exactly. Owen carefully rolled the fragile plat back into its storage tube. I'll prepare an expert statement verifying chain of custody. I looked out the recorder's office window toward the mountains beyond town. 8 months of harassment suddenly made perfect sense. Elaine hadn't been trying to make my life miserable. That had simply been the cheapest path toward something much larger. Grace gathered the documents into a leather binder. We've got one advantage now. What's that? They think they're still ahead. She closed the binder with a quiet snap. And people who think they're winning usually become impatient. I knew that sound. I'd heard it around heavy equipment my entire career. Machines made mistakes when operators rushed them. People weren't much different. As we walked toward the parking lot, Grace stopped beside my truck. Cool. Yeah? If construction equipment ever enters that easement before we stop this, she let the sentence hang for a moment. The legal fight becomes 10 times harder. I looked back toward my cabin in my mind, toward the broken lock, toward the maps scattered across my kitchen table. For the first time since this whole mess began, I understood exactly what Elaine Whitford had been chasing. The only question now was how far she was willing to go to get it. Grace answered that question before I could. Farther than someone who's thinking clearly. We sat in her office while she arranged copies of the original easement, the fraudulent corridor application, and my deed into separate folders. I can file suit tomorrow, she said. You don't want to? She smiled. No. That surprised me. Why wait? Because right now we have attempted manipulation. She tapped the broken padlock sitting on the table between us. If we move too early, they'll argue everything was a misunderstanding. And if we don't, they'll convince themselves they're getting away with it. I understood exactly what she meant. People who think they're winning usually become careless. Grace drafted 2 documents that afternoon. The first was a formal cease and desist letter addressed to Elaine Whitford personally. It cited criminal trespass, unlawful entry, interference with recorded property rights, and preservation of evidence. Every allegation referenced dates, photographs, county records, and the surveillance footage. The second letter went to Noah Whitford's consulting company. It demanded immediate preservation of every map, survey, permit application, email, invoice, and digital record connected to my property. No accusations, just legal notice. Once those letters were delivered, destroying evidence could carry consequences of its own. They'll know we're prepared, I said. They'll know we're watching. Same difference. Grace shook her head. No. She slid both certified mail receipts toward me. Prepared people scare bullies. Watched people scare liars. 2 days later, I drove back to my cabin carrying 3 aluminum signs I'd picked up at the county supply store. Private property, no trespassing, video surveillance in use. I bolted one beside the main gate, another at the old logging road. The third overlooked the meadow where the helicopter easement crossed the northeast corner of my land. Anyone entering now would have to ignore multiple warnings. That mattered. So did what came next. Felix arrived that Saturday morning in an aging utility van packed with equipment cases. He'd spent 27 years installing surveillance systems for timber companies before retiring. Unlike most people in his business, he preferred cameras nobody noticed. Within 4 hours, the property had changed. 2 cameras remained obvious. Anyone approaching the gate would see them immediately. The other 4 disappeared into knotholes, fence braces, and weathered cedar posts. Each overlapped another's field of view. No blind spots, no gaps. Felix checked the final monitor. If somebody walks this property, they'll be recorded. If somebody cuts another lock, they'll be recorded. If somebody thinks they found your hidden cameras, he smiled. They probably haven't. Before leaving, he handed me a small receiver. Silent alerts. My phone and mine. If something happens, we'll both know. That evening, I watched the camera feeds while a pot of venison chili simmered on the stove. Everything remained quiet. Too quiet. Monday passed. Nothing. Tuesday. Nothing. Wednesday. Still nothing. No violation notices. No anonymous complaints. No inspectors. No emails. No golf cart parked along the logging road. Elaine Whitford had disappeared. Most people would have celebrated. Grace called instead. Don't relax. I wasn't planning to. Good. Because silence bothers you too. It should. She lowered her voice. I requested copies of recent HOA board agendas. Find anything? Nothing. No discussion about your property. Isn't that good? It means whatever Elaine's planning, she isn't telling the board. I looked through the kitchen window toward the timber gate. Everything stood exactly where I'd left it. Fresh signs, new cameras, locked chain, stillness. Grace spoke again. Cole. Yeah? If she knows she's running out of paperwork, what comes next? People like Elaine don't abandon control. They escalate. After we hung up, I walked the property line one last time before dark. The new gate stood solid. The fresh chain reflected the fading light. Everything appeared exactly as it should. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that the mountain was holding its breath. Because every time Elaine Whitford had gone quiet before, something worse had followed. The next move didn't arrive in my mailbox. It arrived in everyone else's. Claire Dawson called me on a Thursday evening. I almost let it go to voicemail. I didn't recognize the number. Mr. Mercer? Speaking. My name is Claire Dawson. I live inside Cedar Ridge. There was a hesitation before she continued. I think you should know what's being said about you. 10 minutes later, an email landed in my inbox. Subject line, Community Safety Advisory. It carried the official Cedar Ridge Preserve HOA logo. According to the message, an adjacent property owner had begun storing dangerous materials, attracting suspicious visitors, and creating a potential wildfire hazard for the neighborhood. My name never appeared. It didn't need to. Everyone in Cedar Ridge knew exactly whose cabin sat beyond the eastern tree line. The final paragraph urged residents to report unusual activity directly to county authorities. I leaned back in my chair. Elaine had changed tactics again. She wasn't trying to pressure me anymore. She was recruiting witnesses who didn't know they were being used. The first sheriff's deputy arrived the following afternoon. Deputy Mason Reed climbed out of his cruiser carrying a clipboard and an expression that suggested he'd rather be somewhere else. I'm guessing this isn't your first visit. It would be my fourth, he sighed. Thought so. I unlocked my workshop, opened every storage cabinet, and showed him exactly what he'd asked to inspect. Chainsaws, fuel cans, spare tractor parts. Nothing illegal, nothing commercial. Nothing remotely resembling the anonymous complaint he'd received. He spent less than 20 minutes walking the property. When we reached the stock pond, he closed his notebook. Mind if I ask you something? Go ahead. Do you know Elaine Whitford? I know of her. He nodded slowly. I've reviewed the previous reports. And? They all end the same way. No violation found. He gave a tired smile. I'll be adding another one. Before leaving, he paused beside my new gate. You've got cameras? 6. Good. He looked toward Cedar Ridge. Keep them running. That evening, Grace called. I just received the deputy's report. Fast. He filed it before leaving your driveway. What does it say? She laughed softly. No evidence supporting complaint. Prior unfounded reports involving same complainant noted for context. Context? That's lawyer language. For what? A pattern. Patterns mattered. Judges noticed patterns. Insurance companies noticed patterns. Juries noticed patterns. People making false complaints rarely understood they were documenting themselves. Saturday morning brought another surprise. Claire Dawson pulled into my driveway in an aging Subaru carrying a thick manila envelope. She looked over her shoulder twice before stepping onto my porch. I can't stay long. You don't have to. She handed me the envelope. I copied these before anyone knew they were missing. Inside were HOA board meeting minutes, email printouts, voting records. Grace arrived 20 minutes later. We spread everything across my kitchen table. Claire pointed to 3 separate email chains. Those newsletters Elaine sent? Grace nodded. They were never approved. Claire flipped to another's page. Neither were the environmental reports. Another. The county complaints. Another. The legal notices. Every official action Elaine had claimed was authorized by the HOA had never been presented to the board. No motion, no vote, no approval. Grace circled one sentence buried in 6 months of meeting minutes. President authorized to act independently only during immediate emergencies affecting HOA-owned property. My property wasn't HOA-owned. It wasn't even inside the HOA. Claire folded her hands. Most of us thought she was following procedure. When did you realize she wasn't? The day she started talking about your land at meetings. What did she say? Claire looked directly at me. She said eventually you'd have no choice. Silence settled across the room. Grace gathered the emails into a separate binder. This changes everything. How? It stops being one homeowner versus an HOA. She tapped the stack of unauthorized communications. It becomes one board president abusing an organization. Claire stood. I should go. Before leaving, she stopped at the front door. There's something else. Grace looked up. What? Claire's voice dropped almost to a whisper. The board thinks Elaine gave up. And? She hasn't. Claire looked toward the road before speaking again. She's planning one last operation. What kind of operation? I don't know. She swallowed hard. But whatever she's doing, the rest of the board doesn't know about it. After Claire drove away, Grace closed the final binder. Outside, the mountains were already slipping toward winter. Inside my cabin, the evidence had finally begun speaking louder than Elaine ever could. But if Claire was right, Elaine Whitford had already decided paperwork wasn't enough anymore. Grace called 3 days later. You're still planning to spend Saturday in Libby? I've got tractor parts to pick up. Good. Her answer caught me off guard. You almost sound like you want me gone. I do. Grace, if Elaine believes the cabin is empty, she'll stop pretending. I looked toward the surveillance monitor sitting beside my kitchen window. You think she'll come back? I think she's running out of options. By Friday evening, every piece was in place. The certified cease and desist letters had been delivered. The cameras had fresh batteries. Felix tested the remote alert system one final time. Deputy Mason Reed had copies of my recorded deed, the original helicopter easement, and the criminal trespass notice Grace had prepared in case anyone crossed the posted boundary again. No one planned an ambush. We simply prepared for a predictable mistake. Saturday morning, I drove into Libby exactly as I normally would. I bought hydraulic fittings I didn't urgently need, stopped for coffee, walked through the hardware store slowly enough that anyone watching would believe I intended to stay in town. At 10:42, my phone vibrated. Motion alert, East Gate. I didn't open it, not yet. 2 minutes later, another alert appeared. Multiple subjects detected. Then my phone rang. Felix. They're here. Who? Elaine. And Noah. I pulled into an empty parking lot and opened the camera feed. Elaine's SUV rolled to a stop beside my gate. Noah climbed out carrying the same red-handled bolt cutters I'd seen on the first recording. Elaine unfolded a large laminated map across the hood of the SUV. She pointed toward the northeast meadow. Noah nodded. He walked directly to the chain. One squeeze, the fresh lock snapped apart. Again. This time 6 cameras watched instead of 4. The gate swung open. Neither of them hesitated. They crossed beneath 3 separate no trespassing signs without so much as looking up. Elaine carried a clipboard. Noah hauled a bundle of orange survey stakes and a compact GPS surveying unit. They weren't inspecting. They were laying out a route. I switched to another camera overlooking the meadow. Noah planted the first orange stake, then another. Each one lined up precisely with the corridor Grace had shown me inside the recorder's office. Straight across the helicopter easement. Straight toward Cedar Ridge. Felix's voice came back through the phone. Deputies are rolling. How far? About 5 minutes. Elaine stood in the middle of my meadow giving instructions. She pointed toward the tree line. Noah adjusted the GPS pole and drove another stake into the ground. It looked rehearsed. Confident, like they believed this land already belonged to them. 3 minutes later, another vehicle entered the frame, a white county SUV. Deputy Mason Reed stepped out first. A second deputy followed. Elaine turned immediately, smiling as though she'd expected them. Even through the camera, I could see her confidence. She walked toward the deputies holding a folder. Probably the same fabricated corridor documents Noah had been filing for months. Deputy Reed didn't even open it. Instead, he pointed toward the broken chain lying beside the gate. Then toward the warning signs. Then toward Noah. Noah lowered the GPS pole. Elaine began talking. Her hands moved faster. She pointed repeatedly toward the survey stakes. Deputy Reed remained perfectly still. The second deputy photographed the broken lock. Then the bolt cutters. Then every survey stake already planted across my meadow. Another county vehicle arrived. Grace stepped out carrying a leather binder. She walked directly to Deputy Reed, and handed him certified copies of my deed, the original 1974 helicopter easement, and the preservation notices filed earlier that week. Elaine reached for the documents. Deputy Reed stopped her with one raised hand. For the first time since I'd known her name. Elaine Whitford looked uncertain. She glanced toward Noah. He glanced back at the broken gate. Neither of them noticed something else. My phone buzzed again. Not from Felix, from another camera, the one overlooking the ridgeline above the meadow. The audio wasn't recording. It didn't need to. Even through silent video, I could see every deputy look up at exactly the same moment. So did Elaine. So did Noah. Far above the pines, rotor blades were approaching the valley. Even through the silent camera feed, I recognized the sound before the aircraft appeared. Years working with wildfire crews teaches you that helicopters don't wander into mountain valleys by accident. They come because someone planned for them to be there. Deputy Mason Reed looked toward the ridgeline. Grace did the same. Elaine frowned, clearly assuming the aircraft had nothing to do with her. She was wrong. The first helicopter cleared the trees and descended in a slow, controlled approach toward the northeast meadow. Not toward my cabin, not toward Cedar Ridge. Directly toward the same strip of ground where Noah had just driven 6 orange survey stakes into the soil. A second helicopter followed behind it. Then a third. They circled once before settling into a staggered hover over the open meadow. Dust and pine needles swept across the grass. Noah instinctively stepped backward. Elaine raised both hands, waving as though she intended to stop them. Nobody in the air paid the slightest attention. The lead helicopter lifted again and repositioned exactly over the center of the recorded easement. A crew member leaned out, studying the ground below. Seconds later, 2 state wildfire trucks entered the meadow from the county access road beyond the ridge. That access road had never crossed my property. It connected only to the emergency easement Owen had uncovered. Everything happened very quickly after that. A uniformed fire operations supervisor climbed out of the first truck carrying a clipboard and a rolled survey map. Deputy Reed walked directly toward him. Grace met them halfway. The 3 of them spread documents across the hood of the county SUV. The supervisor compared Grace's certified plat to the state's operational map. Then he looked toward the orange stakes. His expression changed immediately. He motioned toward Noah. The deputies removed every survey stake one by one, photographing each location before placing the markers into evidence bags. The bolt cutters followed, then the broken chain, then the GPS surveying unit. Elaine tried to interrupt. She pointed repeatedly toward Noah's application packet. The supervisor never looked at it. Instead, he unfolded a laminated emergency response map. Even through the camera, I could see the thick red symbol crossing my northeast meadow. The same one Owen had shown me. Emergency helicopter landing zone. Protected infrastructure. The supervisor spoke with Deputy Reed for several minutes before turning toward Elaine. She crossed her arms. He shook his head. Then he pointed beyond the meadow toward the mountains. Grace later told me exactly what he said. This landing zone is still active. He tapped the map. We verify it every year before wildfire season. Another tap. If aircraft can't reach this clearing, medical evacuations and fire suppression operations for this district are compromised. Elaine's confidence disappeared. She looked from the helicopters, to the deputies, to Grace, then back toward the survey stakes now sitting inside evidence bags. For the first time, she realized she hadn't challenged a homeowner. She'd interfered with state emergency infrastructure. The lead helicopter finally settled onto the designated landing area. The crew chief stepped out carrying his own inspection checklist. He stopped halfway across the meadow, looked at the disturbed ground where Noah had been surveying only minutes earlier, and quietly photographed everything. No one asked him to. He simply documented what he saw. Independent witnesses. That's what Grace had hoped for all along. People with no connection to me. No connection to Cedar Ridge. No reason to favor either side. Only facts. Deputy Reed accepted the crew chief's photographs before placing the broken padlock and bolt cutters into separate evidence bags. Then he turned towards Elaine. She began speaking again, this time more slowly, more carefully. Whatever explanation she offered, it wasn't enough. The deputies asked Noah to step away from the surveying equipment. He did, without argument. The confidence both of them had carried onto my land that morning was gone. The helicopters remained parked in the meadow for another 40 minutes, while state officials completed their scheduled readiness inspection. Throughout the entire exercise, no one moved the evidence. No one questioned whether the easement existed. No one suggested the HOA had authority there. By the time I drove back from Libby, the helicopters were lifting off one by one, disappearing beyond the western ridge. The meadow looked almost exactly as it had before, except for one thing. The orange stakes were gone. So were Elaine's illusions. As Grace walked toward my truck, she handed me a copy of the state's inspection acknowledgement. "You realize what just happened?" "I think so," she smiled. "No." She looked back toward the departing helicopters. "Today, the strongest witnesses in your case weren't your cameras. They were state officials who arrived on schedule and found your land exactly as your records said it should be." Then she lowered her voice. "And they watched Elaine Whitford trying to change it." I looked back across the meadow. The helicopter crews were gone. The deputies had left. Only the tire tracks remained where everyone had stood, watching the same truth unfold. For 8 months, Elaine had controlled the story. Now the documents were doing the talking. Grace filed the civil complaint the following Monday, not just against Elaine Whitford, against Noah Whitford and Northwest Environmental Resource Consulting as well. The complaint wasn't built on opinions. It was built on chronology. 17 HOA violation notices, 3 dismissed county investigations, the fraudulent consulting reports, the unlawful entry into my cabin, the broken padlocks, the attempted survey, the helicopter easement, the surveillance footage, the state wildfire inspection. Every page supported the next. By the time the binder reached the courthouse, it stood nearly 4 inches thick. 3 days later, county investigators contacted Grace requesting copies of Noah's submitted corridor applications. They already had something we didn't: internal filing records showing when each document had been uploaded, revised, and resubmitted. The timeline mattered. Several maps labeled as existing corridor references had been created months before the underlying applications even existed. Someone hadn't just filed questionable paperwork. Someone had built a paper history backward. Grace had only smiled when she heard. "That's very difficult to explain under oath." Meanwhile, Claire Dawson kept her promise. She attended an emergency HOA board meeting and quietly forwarded me the official agenda afterward. For the first time in over a year, Elaine's name appeared under a section labeled Executive Conduct Review. The meeting lasted nearly 3 hours. Claire called me that evening. "I've never seen anything like it." "What happened?" "They thought they were discussing public relations." "And?" Then the attorney started asking questions. Questions like, who authorized the environmental reports? Who approved the neighborhood newsletters? Who voted to pursue enforcement against non-member property? The room went quiet, because there had never been votes. Claire told me one board member asked Elaine where the authority came from. Elaine answered the same way she always had. "As president." The association's attorney corrected her immediately. "No." Claire said you could hear chairs moving across the room after that. People stopped looking at me as the problem. They started looking at Elaine. Within 48 hours, the HOA hired independent legal counsel. Not to defend Elaine, to protect the homeowners from Elaine. That was the turning point. Until then, Cedar Ridge residents believed they were standing behind their president. Now they understood she had exposed every homeowner to potential liability by acting without authorization. The emails Claire had copied became critical. Each one showed Elaine sending official communications using HOA letterhead without recorded board approval. The newsletters, the complaints, the environmental reports, even the legal threats. Every unauthorized action carried the association's name. None carried the association's vote. Then another surprise arrived. Deputy Mason Reed stopped by my cabin carrying a thin evidence envelope. The crime lab finished with the bolt cutters. I looked at him. They're mine? No. He handed me a receipt instead. Returned to Noah. So why tell me? Because they documented metal transfer. From what? The chain, he smiled. The cutters matched the marks on both broken padlocks. Not a dramatic discovery, just another piece, another fact, another link in the chain. Grace added the report to the binder without saying much. She didn't need to. The evidence no longer depended on one witness. It reinforced itself. Every document supported another. Every photograph matched a report. Every timeline overlapped. Every official record pointed in the same direction. Late Friday afternoon, Claire called again. This time her voice sounded almost relieved. It's over. What is? The board asked for Elaine's resignation. And? She tried to refuse. I waited. The attorney asked everyone except board members to leave the room. What happened after that? I don't know. Another pause. But 30 minutes later, Claire exhaled. Elaine walked out carrying a cardboard box. She wasn't smiling anymore. Her office had been emptied before sunset. The resignation became official the following morning. Most newspapers would have called that the ending. Grace didn't. She closed the latest court filing and looked across her desk. Don't mistake resignation for accountability. What comes next? The legal consequences. She slid another folder toward me. For the first time since finding that broken padlock in the gravel. The biggest threat no longer came from Elaine Whitford. It came from the evidence she had created herself. The settlement conference lasted less than 4 hours. Grace had warned me not to expect dramatic speeches or surprise witnesses. Civil cases, she told me, are usually decided long before everyone sits in the same room. She was right. By the time we arrived, every document had already been exchanged. The surveillance footage, the certified deeds, the original 1974 helicopter easement, the state wildfire inspection report, Deputy Mason Reed's reports, the unauthorized HOA emails Claire had preserved, the county filing history exposing Noah's fabricated corridor documents. There wasn't one piece of evidence. There were hundreds. Elaine sat across the table beside her attorney. For the first time since I'd met her, she wasn't carrying a binder. She wasn't giving instructions. She barely looked up. Noah spoke only once. His attorney answered nearly every question for him. Grace didn't waste time. She opened the master binder and walked through the timeline exactly as we'd built it over the past 8 months. The false HOA notices, the dismissed investigations, the fake consulting company, the unlawful entry into my cabin, the broken locks, the attempted survey, the helicopter easement, the state inspection. She never raised her voice. She didn't need to. The documents spoke for themselves. About halfway through the meeting, the HOA's new attorney made something very clear. The association, he said, did not authorize the actions giving rise to this litigation. That sentence changed everything. The HOA had officially separated itself from Elaine. She was no longer speaking for the neighborhood. She was answering for herself. Before the day ended, an agreement was reached. Elaine resigned permanently from every position connected to Cedar Ridge Preserve. Noah dissolved Northwest Environmental Resource Consulting and agreed never to submit another filing relating to my property. The HOA recorded a formal acknowledgement that my land had never been subject to its jurisdiction. The proposed recreational corridor applications were withdrawn. Every filing referencing shared access across my property was rescinded. Most important of all, The emergency helicopter easement remained exactly as it had been recorded decades earlier. Protected. Limited to state emergency operations. Nothing more. The settlement also compensated my legal expenses, property damage, and the costs created by months of false complaints. It wasn't enough to erase what had happened. It wasn't supposed to. Justice isn't about pretending nothing happened. It's about making sure it can't happen the same way again. Several weeks later, I stood beside the old gate with a new length of galvanized chain stretched across the entrance. The replacement lock was heavier than the first one. I clicked it shut, tugged on it once, and slipped the key into my pocket. Felix had already adjusted the camera angles. Grace had recorded the final easement documents. Owen sent me a framed copy of the original 1974 survey with a handwritten note across the bottom. History only protects the people willing to read it. I hung it above my desk. Claire stopped by one afternoon carrying a small basket of homemade bread. "The board voted yesterday," she said. "For what?" "We're rewriting the bylaws. So this never happens again," she smiled. "That's the idea." Months passed. Winter gave way to spring. The meadow turned green again. One clear morning I heard the familiar rhythm of rotor blades echo across the valley. I stepped onto the porch and watched a state wildfire helicopter cross above the pines before descending toward the emergency landing zone for its annual readiness exercise. This time there were no orange survey stakes, no arguments, no deputies, no broken locks lying in the gravel. The aircraft landed exactly where it was supposed to, just as the original survey intended 50 years earlier. I stood there until the helicopter lifted off again and disappeared beyond the ridge. People sometimes ask me if I hate Elaine Whitford. The answer surprises them. I don't. Hate would have kept me looking backward. The law kept me moving forward. What saved my land wasn't anger. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't luck. It was a county deed, an old survey, a handful of honest people, 6 cameras, and the simple decision to document the truth before someone else rewrote it. Every now and then, I still unlock that gate at sunrise. The hinges sound the same. The cabin smells like cedar and coffee. The mountains remain exactly where they've always been. And every time I hear helicopters overhead now, I don't think about the day someone tried to steal a corner of my land. I think about the day the truth landed there first.
If this experience taught me anything, it's that protecting what's matter doesn't always begin with a courtroom or a confrontation. Sometimes it begins with keeping good records, asking careful questions, and refusing to let frustration make your decision for you. I didn't sell my land by being louder than anyone else. I sell it by staying patient, documenting the facts, and trusting that the truth becomes stronger when it's backed by evidence instead of emotion. That's something worth remembering whether you're protecting a family cabin, a small ranch, or simply standing up for what's right in your own community. Real strength isn't measured by how hard you fight people. It's measured by how steady you remain when life gives you every reason to lose your footing. Now I'd like to hear from you. Have you ever dealt with an HOA, a property dispute, or a situation where knowing your right makes all the difference? Share your story in the comments. If you stand your ground the way Con did, just type yes below. I always enjoy reading your experience, and chances are someone else in this community will learn something from them too. If stories like this remind you that patience, integrity, and the rule of law still matters, I'd be honored if you subscribe. We got many more stories of ordinary people protecting their land, their homes, and their dignity, and I'd love to have you here for the next one.